In 1619, near a port close to Jamestown, about 20 African captives first arrived in Virginia on the pirate ship White Lion. This marked the start of slavery in what would later become the United States. It continued for over 200 years and was filled with deep injustice, racism, cruel killings, terrible tortures, ruthless exploitation, endless hard work, and immense suffering for the enslaved people who had no rights. The main work done by the British in North America was farming. By the late 1600s, more than 82% of the settlers were involved in agriculture. At that time, growing tobacco brought the highest profits, around 400%. But the tough conditions on tobacco plantations made white workers unwilling to stay long. Native Indians also refused to work on these crops. Because of this labor shortage, plantation owners turned to bringing in enslaved people from tropical Africa. In the early 1500s, European colonial leaders, driven by ideas of religious superiority and strong prejudice, viewed other cultures as inferior at best, people who needed the guidance of white Christians, or as less than human at worst. These cruel beliefs, along with a huge desire for wealth, were used to justify enslaving people of different races and faiths. Spanish, Portuguese, English, and Dutch traders mostly captured or bought Africans from the west coast of Africa. Many were seized by local chiefs during wars or raids, and then sold to Europeans. At times, the slavers themselves led attacks inland to capture people, gold, and ivory. By the mid-1600s, the price of one enslaved person on the coast of what is now Côte d'Ivoire was about 100 gallons of rum or 2 to 4 pounds sterling. In the Americas, that price rose 5 to 6 times higher. The biggest centers of the slave trade in North America were New York, Boston, Charleston, and New Orleans. The ships' holds were filthy, crowded, and lacked air, food, and space. Harsh punishments were common, and 21 to 65% of the captives died during the voyage. High profits pushed traders to bring more people, so between 1751 and 1775, over 84,000 Africans were officially brought to the 13 colonies. From 1801 to 1807, more than 109,000 were imported into the United States. In total, over 597,000 people were taken from Africa. 26% came from the areas of modern Congo and Angola, 24% from Nigeria, 14% from Ghana, and 13% from Senegal and Gambia. Local leaders in the English colonies often owned slaves themselves and pushed hard to make slavery legal sooner than it was in England. Slavery became legal in Massachusetts in 1641, in Virginia in 1661, and in Maryland in 1664. In New Jersey, it was fully established by law in 1704. To keep clear divisions between white servants and black slaves, racism was encouraged and strict racial rules were set. In 1639, Virginia made a law that punished white people with jail or other penalties if they slept with, gathered with, married, or had sexual relations with people of other races. Maryland passed similar rules in 1661 and Carolina in 1671. But these laws did not apply to rich slave owners or their associates who raped or forced sexual contact on powerless black slaves. Enslaved Africans had almost no protection under the laws of most English colonies. In the early 1700s, owners could use any kind of physical violence, bloody torture, or even kill their slaves without facing punishment. Slaves had very limited freedom to move. In Virginia, a black slave could be cut into pieces if caught on the street after 9 p.m. Sometimes family members or children were punished for a relative's actions by having fingers or ears cut off. In the English colonies, slaves were treated like property or tools that helped owners make money. In the southern colonies, slaves worked long hours under brutal conditions in the hot sun on cotton or tobacco fields. A workday could last 14 to 18 hours, and any attempt to rest without permission was met with whipping. In the northern areas, slave labor was used on farms, in forests, in metalwork, and in textile production. Some slaves worked as household servants who had to obey every command of their owners. Under such horrible living and working conditions, the average life of a working slave lasted only 7 to 10 years. Because of this suffering, slaves tried to run away. They also resisted quietly through slow work or small acts of defiance. Sometimes resistance turned violent. In 1712, black slaves in New York rose up against their harsh treatment, but the uprising was crushed quickly. 22 people were executed after public torture. One was burned alive to scare others. In 1739, around 200 slaves rebelled at the Stono plantation near Charleston. They killed several planters, looted homes, and tried to reach Spanish Florida, but the local militia stopped them. In New York City in 1741, over 100 Africans were accused of setting fires with little proof. 34 were tortured and killed, and 84 were tortured then sold to the West Indies. The bloodiest slave revolt in American history happened in 1831 in Virginia. It was led by Nat Turner. The rebels killed more than 60 white people, including some women and children of slave owners, but the local militia and guards defeated them. Over 160 rebels died during the fighting. The Declaration of Independence spoke of democratic ideals, but it did not free black slaves because many powerful slave owners stayed in power. The first U.S. president, George Washington, owned 84 African American slaves. The fourth president, James Madison, wrote in a letter that each slave earned him $240 profit per year. In 1793, Eli Whitney from Virginia invented the cotton gin. This machine cleaned cotton much faster and made cotton growing far more profitable for Southern planters. This brought more money into the slave-based cotton industry and made slave owners fight even harder to keep slavery alive. In the northern states, the Industrial Revolution needed skilled, motivated workers. Powerless, uneducated slaves who often resisted were not suitable for new machines, so those states slowly ended slavery. Vermont was the first to abolish it in 1777. Pennsylvania followed in 1780, Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 1783, Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, and New York in 1799. In the early 1800s, Southern states passed new laws to make the lives of black slaves even harder and to lock in slavery forever. Some laws banned black people from learning to read or write. Missouri passed such a law in 1819, Georgia in 1829, and between 1832 and 1834, Alabama, Louisiana, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina did the same. The United States was a federal nation with complex rules for electing the Senate and President through state representatives. So the free northern states and the slave southern states made the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Missouri entered as a slave state and Maine as a free state. New states west of the Mississippi and north of the 36°30 parallel were to be free. Usually, one slave state and one free state were admitted together. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. It forced everyone in the country, even in northern states, to help catch runaway slaves. A white person with voting rights could claim someone was a fugitive just by swearing to it. This led to more kidnappings of free black people from the North, who were then enslaved in the South. This happened to Solomon Northup, who was taken from New York and spent 12 years in slavery in Louisiana. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 canceled the Missouri Compromise and let new territories decide for themselves about slavery. This caused pro-slavery groups from the South and anti-slavery groups from the North to rush into Kansas with weapons, leading to violent fighting known as Bleeding Kansas. It helped bring on the Civil War. Abolitionists, people who wanted to end slavery, grew stronger in the 1830s. They wrote books and articles exposing the cruelty of slave owners. They held public talks and helped slaves escape through secret routes called the Underground Railroad. The busiest path ran through wooded Ohio, the shortest way. From slave states like Kentucky and Virginia to safety in Canada. Other routes went through Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, or by ship from ports in Maryland, New York, or Boston. Some escaped slaves stayed in northern states with new names, helped by local abolitionists. In total, about 60,000 African Americans escaped slavery this way. Abolitionists also helped buy land in West Africa and created Liberia, where around 17,000 freed African Americans were sent. In 1860, enslaved African Americans made up about 34% of the 12 million people in the slave states. Nearly 1 in 4 Southern families owned slaves. The total value of slaves was more than $3.5 billion, 58 times larger than the entire U.S. government budget at the time and worth much more than all the railroads in the country. When Abraham Lincoln, who opposed slavery, was elected president in 1860, 11 Southern slave states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, Arkansas, and Virginia, left the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. Their attack on Fort Sumter started the Civil War in 1861. It lasted 4 years. More than 200,000 black soldiers, most of them former slaves, fought for the Union Army. Lincoln and most Northern people saw slavery as cruel and harmful to progress. In 1862, he issued a proclamation freeing slaves in areas controlled by the Confederacy. After the North won in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution banned all forms of slavery. Slaves were mainly brought to the English colonies from West Africa starting in the early 1600s. They had no rights to freedom, marriage, education, choosing work, or taking part in politics. They were completely helpless against their owners, who often used torture and brutal punishments to control them. Using slave labor on cotton and tobacco plantations gave owners huge profits but held back industrial growth and went against basic moral ideas. For more than 2 centuries, enslaved people faced cruel exploitation. Only the victory of Lincoln and the Northern states in the Civil War finally brought them freedom.